Part 1. The call that changed everything. Some phone calls don't interrupt your life. They quietly divide it into everything before and everything after. At exactly 6:17 on a chilly October morning, Margaret Lawson reached for her ringing cell phone before the second buzz could wake the silence that had become her closest companion. At 58, she had grown accustomed to peaceful mornings in her modest Connecticut home. Since losing her husband 4 years earlier, routines had become her anchor. Fresh coffee brewed at 6. The morning news played softly in the background. A walk around the neighborhood if the weather cooperated. It wasn't an exciting life, but it was steady, and steady had become enough. The voice on the other end belonged to Dr. Emily Carter, the physician who had cared for Margaret's parents for nearly a decade. Her calm tone immediately unsettled Margaret. Doctors rarely called before sunrise unless something truly mattered. "Margaret," the doctor began gently, "your mother and father are safe, but we need to talk about their living situation." Margaret sat down at the kitchen table without realizing she had done so. Her coffee maker clicked in the background, filling the room with a familiar aroma that suddenly felt distant. Dr. Carter explained that Margaret's 83-year-old father had become increasingly forgetful over the past several months. He had recently left the stove on overnight after making tea. Her 80-year-old mother, who had always managed the household with quiet determination, had suffered 2 minor falls within the last 6 weeks. Neither incident caused serious injury, but together they painted a picture that could no longer be ignored. "They love their farmhouse," Dr. Carter continued. "I know what it means to them, but they can no longer safely live there alone." The words settled heavily in Margaret's chest. That white farmhouse had been in the Lawson family for more than 60 years. It was where she had learned to ride a bicycle, where Thanksgiving dinners stretched late into the evening, where every Christmas morning began with cinnamon rolls cooling on the kitchen counter. Every room carried memories that refused to fade. Selling it had never been part of anyone's conversation because leaving had never seemed imaginable. Margaret thanked the doctor, promised to drive over that afternoon, and ended the call. The quiet house suddenly felt enormous. She looked toward the framed photograph of her late husband resting beside the window. His familiar smile seemed to ask the same question echoing through her mind. What happens when the people who taught you how to stand can no longer stand on their own? She picked up her car keys, canceled every appointment on her calendar, and packed an overnight bag almost without thinking. As she pulled onto the highway toward the farmhouse where her childhood still waited among maple trees and weathered fences, Margaret had no idea that this journey would ask her to become more than a daughter. It would ask her to rediscover the meaning of family, sacrifice, and the quiet promises that sometimes take an entire lifetime to keep. Part 2. The locked room upstairs. Margaret arrived at the farmhouse just before noon, the familiar gravel driveway crunching beneath her tires exactly as it had throughout her childhood. The weathered white siding looked unchanged, but the house itself seemed quieter, as though it had been holding its breath for years. Her father greeted her with a warm smile that briefly hid the worry in his eyes, while her mother embraced her a little longer than usual. They laughed over lunch, pretending everything was normal. Yet Margaret couldn't ignore the small signs Dr. Carter had described. Her father searched 3 different kitchen drawers before finding the silverware. Her mother instinctively reached for the countertop every time she stood. Neither of them complained, but the truth lingered in every ordinary moment. That afternoon, while helping her mother organize old linens in the upstairs hallway, Margaret noticed a small brass key resting inside a porcelain dish on the windowsill. She had never seen it before. The key was unusually heavy, its handle decorated with tiny oak leaves worn smooth by time. "What does this open?" she asked casually. Her mother looked at it for several seconds before quietly answering, "I almost forgot we still had that." She glanced toward the far end of the hallway where a narrow staircase climbed another half-flight beneath the sloping roof. "There's a storage room up there. Your father locked it years ago." Margaret frowned. "I don't remember there ever being a room." "You were in college by then," her mother replied softly. "After everything happened, we simply closed the door." She never explained what she meant. Curiosity followed Margaret as she climbed the creaking wooden steps. Dust floated through thin beams of afternoon sunlight leaking from a small attic window. At the end of the landing stood an old oak door almost hidden behind forgotten picture frames and folded quilts. The brass lock had darkened with age, untouched for decades. Margaret slipped the key into the lock. At first it refused to turn. She gently tried again until a deep metallic click echoed through the silent hallway. The door slowly opened inward with a long groan from its old hinges. A cool scent of cedar, paper, and thyme drifted into the hallway. Nothing inside appeared abandoned. Instead, everything seemed carefully preserved, as though someone had expected another person to walk through that doorway someday. Shelves lined every wall. Neatly labeled boxes sat beside polished wooden trunks. A rocking horse she remembered from early childhood stood in one corner without a speck of dust. Folded quilts rested inside cedar chests. Family photographs filled one table, but many faces were unfamiliar. Margaret stepped farther inside, puzzled by how much of her family's history had remained hidden only a few feet above the bedrooms where she had slept for years. Then she noticed an old calendar hanging on the wall. Every month had been marked by hand with neat blue ink circles around certain dates stretching across nearly 20 years. Beside each circle was only a first name. Some names appeared once. Others returned year after year. None belonged to relatives she recognized. Beneath the calendar rested a sturdy wooden desk. Inside its top drawer lay dozens of carefully bundled letters tied with faded blue ribbon. Every envelope had been addressed in her father's unmistakable handwriting, yet none carried a mailing address or postage stamp. It looked as though they had never been sent. Resting on top of the bundle was a single folded note written in her mother's handwriting. It contained only one sentence. "If Margaret is reading this, then the time has finally come for her to know why we kept every promise." Part 3: The families who remembered them. Margaret barely slept that night. The unopened letters, the calendar filled with unfamiliar names, and her mother's cryptic note refused to leave her mind. At sunrise she carefully gathered the first 3 envelopes that included complete addresses, each sealed but labeled with dates spanning more than 20 years. The closest address was less than 15 miles away in a quiet Connecticut town she had driven through countless times without ever stopping. She expected awkward conversations and unanswered questions. Instead, she found something she could never have imagined. The modest blue house belonged to an elderly woman named Helen Brooks, who opened the door with cautious curiosity. Margaret introduced herself and quietly mentioned her parents' names. Before she could explain another word, Helen's eyes filled with tears. "You're Harold and Evelyn's daughter," she whispered. Margaret nodded. Helen reached for her hand as though greeting a member of her own family. "I've wondered if I'd ever meet you." Inside the cozy living room hung a framed photograph of Helen's late husband standing beside Margaret's father in front of a freshly painted barn. Helen explained that nearly 30 years earlier her husband had lost his job just weeks before Christmas. Without telling anyone, Margaret's parents had quietly paid several months of their mortgage and anonymously left groceries on the porch every Friday evening until he found work again. They had refused every attempt to be repaid. "Your father said kindness only counts when nobody expects applause," Helen recalled with a smile. Before Margaret left, Helen handed her a faded Christmas card signed only with the words, "Keep believing in tomorrow." The handwriting belonged unmistakably to her mother. The second address led Margaret to a family-owned hardware store. The owner, David Morales, listened quietly as she introduced herself before walking to the wall behind the cash register. He removed an old black-and-white photograph showing a teenage boy wearing an apron inside the same store decades earlier. "That's me," David said. "My parents immigrated here with almost nothing. When my father became seriously ill, your parents spent nearly every weekend helping us keep this place open. Your mother balanced the books. Your father repaired shelves, stocked inventory, even shoveled snow from the parking lot before customers arrived. They never accepted a single dollar." Margaret stared at the photograph, realizing she had never known where her parents disappeared to on so many Saturdays during her teenage years. She had assumed they were visiting friends. They had been serving strangers who eventually became family. The third address stood outside a small church surrounded by maple trees. A middle-aged pastor welcomed Margaret into his office after hearing her story. Without hesitation he unlocked a filing cabinet and retrieved a thick folder labeled simply Lawson Family. Inside were thank you letters, photographs, and handwritten notes spanning more than 2 decades. Families described anonymous tuition payments, emergency home repairs, medical bills quietly covered, and holiday meals delivered without signatures. Many believed a church charity had helped them until years later when someone gently revealed the truth. Margaret's hands trembled as she turned each page. Every act of generosity had been carefully documented by the grateful recipients, yet her parents had never mentioned a single one. As the pastor closed the folder, he smiled knowingly. "Your parents asked us for one favor. They said if anyone ever came looking for answers, we should wait until the right time." He reached beneath his desk and placed a small wooden box in front of Margaret. Carved into the lid were the same tiny oak leaves she had seen on the mysterious brass key. Attached to the handle was a note written in her father's unmistakable handwriting. It read, "This box is not for us. It's for the day our daughter is finally ready to understand why every name on that calendar mattered." Margaret slowly lifted the lid, her heart racing, unaware that the first item inside would completely redefine everything she believed about her family's past. Part 4: The Promise Made Inside the Courthouse. Margaret carefully lifted the first item from the wooden box. It was not money, a deed, or an old photograph. Instead, it was a weathered leather journal with her father's initials pressed into the faded cover. The pages had yellowed with age, and the first entry was dated nearly 35 years earlier. She sat alone in one of the church's quiet meeting rooms as afternoon sunlight stretched across the wooden floor. Taking a slow breath, she opened the journal. The very first sentence stopped her cold. "Everything changed the day your mother and I walked into the county courthouse believing we were there to solve our own problem." Margaret continued reading. At the time, her parents had been struggling financially after a difficult year on the farm. Equipment repairs, poor harvests, and unexpected medical expenses had left them overwhelmed. They had gone to the courthouse to complete paperwork related to refinancing part of their property. While waiting outside a clerk's office, they noticed a young couple sitting on a nearby bench with two small children. The parents looked exhausted, quietly discussing how they might lose their home before winter. According to the journal, Harold and Evelyn couldn't stop thinking about them even after leaving the building. They eventually returned, introduced themselves, and spent nearly an hour listening to the family's story. Several weeks later, after much discussion and prayer, they anonymously covered enough overdue payments to give the family a fresh start. The journal described something Margaret had never known about her father. "That afternoon," he had written, "I realized that almost everyone entering a courthouse carries an invisible burden. Some leave with relief. Others leave believing no one noticed them. We decided that if we were ever able, we would quietly become the answer to someone's hardest day." Margaret turned another page. The journal explained that her parents had made a private promise inside that courthouse before driving home. Every year, no matter how comfortable or difficult their own circumstances became, they would help at least one family facing a crisis without asking for recognition, repayment, or even gratitude. They would simply step in, solve what they could, and step away. As the years passed, one family became three became 10. Eventually dozens of names filled calendars, notebooks, and carefully organized files. Sometimes they paid utility bills. Sometimes they repaired leaking roofs. Sometimes they quietly funded scholarships, covered rent, replaced broken furnaces before winter, or purchased groceries for households they barely knew. Whenever possible, they remained anonymous because they believed kindness became stronger when it carried no expectation of praise. Margaret's eyes filled as she reached an entry written only 5 years earlier. Her father admitted that age was slowing them down. "We can no longer split firewood as easily or drive across the state after dark," he wrote. "But promises do not retire simply because people grow older." He explained that they had begun organizing records not to celebrate what they had done, but to ensure every commitment would eventually be honored if they were no longer able. Tucked inside the final pages was an official copy of the courthouse document from decades earlier. Folded behind it rested a handwritten letter addressed to Margaret in her mother's elegant script. "If you are reading this," it began, "then we have reached the season of life when our hands are no longer steady enough to carry every promise alone. We never expected you to become us. We only hoped you would understand why this journey mattered." As Margaret gently unfolded the remaining pages, a smaller envelope slipped from between the journal leaves and landed in her lap. Across its front, written by both of her parents together, were 7 simple words that made her heart pound faster than ever before. Open this only after visiting the final family. Part 5. The letter her mother never sent. Margaret left the church, with the wooden box resting carefully on the passenger seat beside her. She glanced several times at the unopened envelope her parents had instructed her not to read until she had visited the final family. Every instinct urged her to break the seal, yet after everything she had learned, she understood that her parents always had a reason for asking someone to wait. Back at the farmhouse, evening settled quietly over the fields as golden sunlight filtered through the old maple trees. Her parents had already gone to bed, exhausted from the day's excitement, leaving the house wrapped in a silence Margaret had never noticed before. She returned to the upstairs storage room determined to organize the remaining boxes before continuing her journey. Each container had been labeled in her mother's careful handwriting. Receipts, calendars, community projects, winter deliveries, scholarships, repairs. The organization was remarkable, almost as though every act of kindness had become part of a much larger story. As she moved one cedar chest away from the wall, she discovered a smaller wooden case hidden behind it. Unlike the others, this one carried no label. Inside were only a few personal keepsakes: an old brooch, several faded family photographs, a pressed autumn leaf tucked inside a Bible, and a cream-colored envelope sealed with blue wax. Across the front, in her mother's unmistakable handwriting, appeared a single name: Margaret Lawson. There was no postage stamp, no mailing address. It had never been intended for the postal service. Her hands trembled as she carefully broke the brittle seal. The first line immediately stole her breath. My dearest Margaret, if you are reading this, then I no longer have the strength to tell you these words face to face. Margaret slowly sat beside the attic window as her mother's gentle voice seemed to come alive through every sentence. Evelyn explained that she had written the letter years earlier after noticing that age was gradually changing both her and Harold. She feared there might come a day when memories would fade faster than love. She wanted her daughter to understand not only what they had done but why they had hidden so much of it. We never kept secrets because we doubted you, the letter read. We kept them because kindness grows differently when it belongs to no one. The moment people know who gave, the story often becomes about the giver instead of the hope that was restored. Margaret wiped away quiet tears as she continued reading. Her mother admitted there had been many evenings when they had wanted to share everything with her, especially after difficult days, but each time they chose silence. They wanted Margaret to build a life free from the weight of their private promise, rather than feeling obligated to inherit it. Then the letter shifted in a direction Margaret never expected. Evelyn described one family they had never included on the calendars, never discussed with the church, and never recorded in the courthouse journal. There is one story your father and I agreed to protect until the proper time, she wrote. Not because it is more important than the others, but because it belongs partly to you. Margaret frowned. She searched the remaining pages for an explanation, but instead found only a small photograph tucked inside the folded paper. It showed a little girl standing between Harold and Evelyn outside the courthouse nearly 30 years earlier. Margaret stared at the child's smiling face. She knew every cousin in her extended family, yet she had never seen this girl before. On the back of the photograph, written in faded blue ink, were 8 words that caused Margaret's heart to race faster than at any point in her journey. The last family was never listed because they were already our family before they ever knew it. Part 6. The child who became a grandfather. The next morning Margaret finally unfolded the last page tucked inside her mother's letter. Written at the bottom was a single name, a complete address in a neighboring Connecticut county, and one short instruction from both of her parents: visit him before opening the final envelope. The name was Thomas Bennett. Unlike the dozens of families listed throughout the journals and calendars, there were no notes explaining who he was or why he mattered. Only the old photograph of the smiling little girl remained in Margaret's purse, its unanswered mystery growing heavier with every mile she drove. Nearly 2 hours later she arrived at a quiet neighborhood where mature oak trees shaded modest brick homes. Children's bicycles rested beside driveways, and flower gardens bloomed despite the warm summer afternoon. She knocked on the front door, uncertain what she would say. After a few moments, a tall elderly man with silver hair and kind blue eyes answered. He leaned lightly on a wooden cane but stood with quiet confidence. Before Margaret could introduce herself, she removed the photograph from her purse. "I'm looking for Thomas Bennett," she said gently. "I think my parents knew you." The man's expression changed instantly. He stared at the photograph as though time itself had paused. His eyes widened, and for several long seconds he could not speak. Finally he whispered, "Harold and Evelyn Lawson." Margaret felt her heart skip. "You knew them?" Thomas looked back at her, his eyes glistening. "Young lady, I'd recognize those two faces anywhere." He invited her inside without another question. The walls of his home were covered with family photographs spanning generations. Grandchildren smiled from graduation pictures, birthday celebrations, fishing trips, and holiday gatherings. Margaret noticed one particular portrait showing Thomas surrounded by nearly 20 relatives. "That's my family," he said proudly. "For children, 11 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren so far." He paused before adding quietly, "None of them would be here if it weren't for your parents." Margaret sat speechless. Thomas walked to an antique cabinet and carefully removed an old scrapbook wrapped in protective cloth. Inside were yellowed newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, and dozens of photographs. Near the center rested the very same courthouse photograph Margaret had discovered inside her mother's letter, only this copy was larger. There stood Harold and Evelyn beside a frightened little girl while a teenage boy stood several feet away with his arm around her shoulders. Thomas gently tapped the boy's face with his finger. "That's me," he said softly. "I was 14 years old." Margaret looked from the picture to the 70-year-old grandfather sitting before her, struggling to connect the smiling teenager with the man across the room. Thomas smiled warmly. "The little girl beside your parents was my baby sister, Anna." He slowly explained that decades earlier, after the sudden loss of their parents, he and Anna had found themselves overwhelmed by legal paperwork, uncertainty, and the frightening possibility of being separated. The courthouse had been the place where adults discussed their future, while 2 frightened children waited on a wooden bench, unsure what tomorrow would bring. "Everyone was busy filling out forms," Thomas recalled. "Except your parents. They were the only strangers who sat down beside us and asked our names." Margaret listened without interrupting as he described how Harold and Evelyn quietly guided them through the months that followed. They helped trustworthy relatives prepare their home, covered expenses that no insurance would pay, encouraged neighbors to rally around the family, and visited often enough that 2 frightened children slowly believed life could become stable again. They never tried to replace anyone. They simply made sure 2 young lives never felt forgotten. Thomas closed the scrapbook and looked directly into Margaret's eyes. "Your father once told me that kindness is measured not by what people remember about you, but by what they are able to become because someone believed in them." He smiled toward the laughter of grandchildren playing somewhere in the backyard. "Everything you see in this house began with 2 strangers who refused to walk past a pair of scared children." Then Thomas reached beneath the scrapbook and removed a small envelope Margaret had never seen before. The handwriting on the front belonged unmistakably to Harold Lawson. Beneath Margaret's name were 6 carefully written words that sent a chill through her heart. "Now you may open the final promise." Part 7: The truth her father could finally share. Margaret drove back to the farmhouse with Harold's sealed envelope resting on the passenger seat. She still hadn't opened it. Somehow she knew the final answers did not belong inside paper anymore. They belonged to the man who had spent more than 3 decades quietly carrying them. Dusk settled over the Connecticut countryside as she pulled into the familiar gravel driveway. Through the kitchen window she saw her father sitting alone at the old oak table, slowly polishing a worn coffee mug with the same checkered towel he had used for years. He looked older than he had only a week before, yet there was an unmistakable calm in his expression, almost as though he had been expecting this conversation all along. Margaret entered quietly and placed the unopened envelope on the table between them. Harold looked at it, smiled gently and nodded. "You found Thomas," he said. It was not a question. Margaret pulled out a chair and sat across from him. "He told me about the courthouse, about Anna, about everything you and Mom did for them." Harold remained silent for a long moment, his eyes resting on the envelope before lifting toward his daughter. "Not everything," he replied softly. Margaret reached across the table and took his hand. "Then tell me now. No more protecting me. No more waiting. I know why you helped people, but I still don't know why you hid one family from every journal and every calendar. Harold exhaled slowly, as if setting down a burden he had carried for half his life. Because that story never belonged to us alone. He leaned back and looked toward the darkening fields beyond the kitchen window. The day we met Thomas and Anna at the courthouse, we weren't simply watching two frightened children. We were watching ourselves. Margaret frowned. Harold explained that when he was only 10 years old, his own father had died unexpectedly, leaving the family farm on the edge of collapse. For months his widowed mother struggled to keep food on the table. One winter morning an unknown couple delivered groceries, paid overdue bills, and arranged repairs to the farmhouse before disappearing without leaving their names. We searched for years to thank them, Harold said with a quiet smile. No one ever knew who they were. Evelyn had experienced something similar as a teenager when a retired schoolteacher secretly paid for college application fees that her family could not afford. She, too, never learned the woman's identity. Before we met each other, Harold continued, both of us had already been rescued by strangers. Margaret listened in silence as the final pieces slowly came together. When we saw Thomas and Anna sitting on that courthouse bench, Harold said, it felt like someone had placed our own childhoods right in front of us again. We weren't helping strangers anymore. We were honoring the people who had once carried us when no one else knew we needed it. Tears filled Margaret's eyes as she realized the promise had never truly begun inside the courthouse. The courthouse had simply been the moment two separate stories of kindness became one shared mission. Harold gently picked up the sealed envelope and finally handed it to her. Go ahead, he whispered. You've earned it. Margaret carefully opened the envelope. Inside was only a single folded page bearing the signatures of both her parents. There were no legal documents, no bank accounts, no instructions dividing property. Instead, one sentence appeared in large handwritten letters across the center of the page. Kindness was never meant to end with us. Beneath those words rested another folded sheet. Margaret unfolded it slowly and discovered hundreds of blank lines arranged in neat columns. At the top her mother had written a simple title, Families Yet to Be Met. Margaret looked up at her father, unable to speak. Harold smiled through tears that neither of them tried to hide. Those pages were always left empty, he said. Not because we ran out of people to help, but because we believed someone else would one day continue writing the story. At that very moment a knock echoed through the farmhouse door. Neither of them had been expecting visitors. Harold glanced toward the entrance, then back at Margaret with a knowing smile. I have a feeling, he said quietly, that your first blank line has just arrived. Part 8, Becoming the Keeper of Their Legacy. The knock at the farmhouse door came just as Harold finished speaking. Margaret opened it to find a young couple standing nervously on the front porch. The husband held a worn baseball cap in both hands while his wife balanced a sleepy little boy on her hip. Before either of them could introduce themselves, Harold called from the kitchen with a quiet smile. Please invite them in. Margaret looked back in surprise. You know them? Harold nodded. I've been expecting them for almost a week. Once everyone was seated around the old kitchen table, the young man explained that his family had recently purchased a neighboring property after relocating for work. A sudden series of unexpected expenses had left them worried about keeping the house. They had been told by the church pastor that Harold Lawson might know of local resources. Harold listened carefully, asking only a few gentle questions. When the couple finished speaking, he turned toward Margaret instead of answering them. For the first time since she had discovered the hidden room upstairs, he remained completely silent. Margaret understood immediately. Her father was not refusing to help. He was quietly stepping aside. She looked at the blank ledger lying beside her and remembered the title her mother had written in graceful blue ink. Families Yet to Be Met. Without hesitation, Margaret wrote the date on the very first empty line. Harold noticed the movement and smiled with unmistakable pride. No speeches were necessary. A new chapter had already begun. Over the following months, Margaret rearranged nearly every part of her life. She reduced her work schedule, spent several days each week caring for her parents, and dedicated the remaining time to organizing the countless records they had preserved over decades. The upstairs storage room gradually transformed from a forgotten attic into a living archive of quiet generosity. She digitized journals, restored fading photographs, organized calendars, and carefully documented every family story she could verify. Yet she followed the one rule her parents had never broken. Names remained private unless permission had been given. The purpose was never recognition. It was remembrance. As Harold and Evelyn grew weaker, they often sat together on the farmhouse porch watching autumn leaves drift across the fields. Some afternoons they would ask Margaret how the first blank page was coming along. She always answered with a smile. It isn't blank anymore. By the end of winter, 5 new families had quietly found hope through small acts of compassion. One received help replacing a failed heating system before a freezing January storm. Another family discovered that anonymous scholarship assistants had allowed their daughter to remain in nursing school. An elderly veteran found volunteers repairing the wheelchair ramp outside his home before he even knew someone had noticed it was unsafe. Margaret never signed her name. Sometimes she mailed gift cards with no return address. Sometimes she left grocery deliveries before sunrise. Sometimes she simply connected neighbors willing to help one another. Each time she remembered her mother's words. Kindness grows differently when no one owns the applause. One snowy afternoon, Harold asked Margaret to wheel him upstairs to the once locked storage room. He looked around slowly at the organized shelves, restored journals, and carefully labeled boxes before quietly saying, "This room doesn't belong to the past anymore." Margaret squeezed his hand. "No," she answered. "It belongs to the future." Harold pointed toward the newest shelf where the fresh ledger rested beside the older calendars. Several pages were already filled with careful handwriting. "Promise me something," he said softly. "Don't measure success by how many names appear there. Measure it by how many people never feel alone." Margaret nodded, unable to speak through the emotion in her throat. Harold smiled one final time before looking toward the attic window where afternoon sunlight poured across the wooden floor exactly as it had on the day Margaret first unlocked the room. "Your mother and I always hoped the secret would survive us," he whispered. "Now I know it will." Later that evening, after her parents had gone to bed, Margaret returned to the ledger to record one final note from the day. As she closed the cover, she noticed something she had somehow overlooked beneath the bottom drawer of the old desk. Taped carefully underneath was a small envelope addressed in her mother's handwriting. Across the front were 7 simple words that immediately made Margaret's heart race once again. "Open this after the story finds its way home." Part 9: The family she never knew she had. 1 year later, the Lawson farmhouse looked more alive than it had in decades. Fresh white paint reflected the soft November sunlight. The old red barn had been carefully restored, and handmade wreaths decorated the porch where Harold and Evelyn had spent so many quiet evenings together. The towering maple trees surrounding the property had surrendered most of their golden leaves, covering the lawn in a blanket that crunched beneath the footsteps of arriving guests. Margaret stood near the front gate, greeting each family with a warm smile. She recognized many faces from the journals, calendars, and letters she had spent the past year organizing, but what amazed her most were the people she had never met before. They came carrying homemade pies, casseroles, fresh bread, photo albums, and grandchildren eager to explore the old farm. Nearly every family shared the same story in different words. At some point in their lives, when hope had seemed impossibly distant, Harold and Evelyn Lawson had quietly appeared without asking for recognition and disappeared before gratitude could become a burden. By early afternoon, more than 100 people filled the property. Long wooden tables stretched across the yard beneath white tents, covered with traditional Thanksgiving dishes prepared by dozens of families working together. Children laughed while chasing one another through the orchard. Teenagers organized games beside the barn. Elderly neighbors exchanged memories on the front porch. Margaret looked around in disbelief. None of these people were connected by blood. Yet every conversation carried the warmth of a family reunion. Harold and Evelyn, though noticeably weaker than a year before, insisted on sitting together in matching rocking chairs overlooking the gathering. They watched quietly as generations of lives they had touched unknowingly met one another for the first time. Neither of them expected applause, yet the sight unfolding before them spoke louder than any standing ovation ever could. During dessert, Thomas Bennett gently tapped a glass with his spoon. The conversations gradually faded into silence as he slowly stood. Most of us believed we were the only family Harold and Evelyn ever helped, he began. Gentle laughter spread across the crowd. Today we've discovered something beautiful. None of us were the only ones. Together, we became something much larger. He invited anyone whose life had been changed by the Lawsons to stand if they wished. Chairs quietly slid backward across the grass. One person stood, then another, then another. Within moments, nearly every adult in attendance was on their feet. Some wiped away tears. Others smiled through joyful memories. Margaret turned toward her parents and noticed the surprise on their faces. Even they had never imagined how many lives had quietly intersected over the decades. Thomas reached beneath the table and lifted a large framed photograph taken earlier that morning. It showed every guest gathered in front of the farmhouse beneath the American flag Harold raised every Memorial Day. Across the bottom, engraved in polished brass, were the words, "Family is sometimes chosen one kindness at a time." Harold lowered his head, overcome with emotion, while Evelyn gently squeezed his hand. Margaret thought the afternoon had already reached its most unforgettable moment, until a familiar envelope slipped from her coat pocket. It was the one hidden beneath the attic desk, still unopened exactly as her mother had instructed. She quietly broke the seal. Inside was a single handwritten letter. "If this day has arrived," Evelyn had written months earlier, "then our story has finally found its way home. Look around you before reading another word. The people standing beside you are the family we always hoped you would discover. Some share our name. Most never will. But every one of them carries the same promise forward." Margaret slowly lifted her eyes from the page. Everywhere she looked, strangers were embracing like lifelong relatives. Children from different families played together without knowing whose grandparents had helped, whose parents decades earlier. The divisions of the past had quietly disappeared, replaced by something far stronger than genealogy. As Margaret folded the letter closed, a little girl no older than 8 approached holding a brand new notebook wrapped in blue ribbon. "Mr. Bennett asked me to give you this," she said with a shy smile before running back toward the others. Margaret untied the ribbon and opened the cover. The first page was blank except for a single handwritten title that immediately brought tears to her eyes. "The Next 50 Years." She slowly turned to the second page, where someone had already written the first sentence. "Every family has a beginning. The strongest families choose, every single day, to become someone else's hope." Please like, subscribe, and share. Thanks for visiting.